Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. I'm Thos Ribbits. Well, there's always one, isn't there? Now, it's become a well-used phrase, possibly because it's mostly true, and of course it's been promulgated by Stephen Sondheim, that content dictates form. And I think most people, if they were setting out to write a musical these days, would remember those three words and take them to heart when designing how they want their new musical to come across. But it's not always as simple as that seems, because as we saw with Oh What a Lovely War only a short while ago here on Musical Talk, content there dictated the subversion of form, by which I mean there was an ironic contrast between the form and the content. One did not immediately follow one from the other. It was the inverse, which therefore made it satirical and parodic, which made Oh What a Lovely War so strong. We were invited to see beyond the form, or perhaps through it, to see that it was making an ironic statement. So content dictates form is a bit more complicated than sometimes we think. Oh What a Lovely War is just the first of a particular run of musicals where the content and the form have this odd relationship, which is based on irony and subversion. And Stephen Sondheim himself is not above using that subversion, as we can see from Assassins. However, I think anyone who thought about it would have to say that the kings of this particular form of musical are Kander and Ebb. Because when you think of their great shows, and we're talking Chicago, Cabaret, and indeed Kiss of the Spider-Woman, and even some of their really obscure shows, like their industrial musical Go Fly a Kite, you can see absolutely that what they've done is found a framework, and that framework works ironically against what's being said to make a stronger point than you would if you were doing it speech marks straight. Close speech marks. And it's hard to believe that here in 2015, it's now 11 years since Fred Ebb died. He, of course, was the lyricist in the relationship with Kander and Ebb, but we have a great deal to be thankful for that they were such a productive team that even when he passed away, there were several other shows in sufficient development for there to be new Kander and Ebb shows coming to Broadway and the West End. Curtains we've discussed several times here on Musical Talk, although we're all waiting for a West End production to arrive. But the show that most recently came to London and was a massive success, and I mean both commercially and artistically, was the Scottsboro Boys. Now, the Scottsboro Boys has a checkered history in a way in terms of its musical success in America. It came to Broadway in 2010, but really didn't do tremendously well. It only lasted 2.5 months or so, with 29 previews and 49 proper performances. And although it was nominated for 12 Tony Awards, it did not win a single one, which apparently is a record, I understand. A record previously held by Kander and Ebb for Steel Pier, where they were nominated for 11 Tony Awards and didn't win a single one. And what's all the more surprising, and I'm afraid depressing to my mind, is that the show that beat them at the Tonys that year was The Book of Mormon. Now, I'm not going to say The Book of Mormon isn't a deserving show. It's certainly a successful show. It's certainly a commercially successful show. But I think it will be hard to argue that it has as much meaning or worth as the Scottsboro Boys. Fortunately, the Scottsboro Boys did come to Britain. It came to London to the Young Vic in 2013 and wowed the audiences and the critics alike when it opened in October of that year. And it sold out. And it did so well, therefore, that it then transferred to the Garrick Theatre in London's West End, where it ran for a limited season between October 2014 and February of 2015. It has therefore only recently closed here in London. I hope you had a chance to see it, or hear about it at least, because it turned out to be one of the best, most moving, one of the most intellectually stimulating shows that I have seen for a very long time. It is simply a great show. And it's not just me who said so. It won stars aplenty from all the quality newspapers in Britain. And frankly, if you can find something that unites The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph and The Times, then you've probably found something rather special. So here are a few facts about the piece itself. Obviously, the music and the lyrics were by John Kander and Fred Ebb, with John Kander replacing his late partner Fred Ebb with the lyric writing responsibilities where that was necessary as the show was developed. The book was by David Thompson, and it was directed and choreographed in London by Susan Stroman, and was based closely on the Broadway production that she'd also directed. But what makes this show surprising is that in Britain, the story of the Scottsboro Boys is really just not known. It's an incredibly awful story. Nobody comes out of it happily or well in any way whatsoever, including the wider public. And that irony, that subversion that we were talking about earlier, when the content and the form are deliberately placed against each other in order to create a dynamic tension, pays off immense dividends in this show. Because the framework device in this Kander and Ebb show is the now absolutely discredited style of minstrelsy, which for the most part was white men blacking up to reinforce African American stereotypes. If you turn that on its head and have black men pretending to be white men, you're doing it to make a point. And this show makes points hand over fist. Interestingly, the Daily Telegraph, I think, got it right in its review when it described the show as one that makes for necessary viewing. I think the word necessary there is really interesting. It's absolutely true. It also went on to describe it as, and listen to these adjectives, an ingenious, pain-filled, feel-good show. Now, you might think that those words can't sit together in the same sentence, and they certainly can't be reflecting a particular show, but the Scottsboro Boys squares the circle and does something quite remarkable. You'll gather that I thought a lot of it. So did Tim Sayward, with whom I went to see it. So now seems a very good time to listen to the conversation he and I had about the fabulous Kander and Ebb show, The Scottsboro Boys. Musical talk. Tim, hello.
Oh, hello, sorry. Hello.
You're coming today from the 21st century.
Yes.
As am I. But we're going to be talking about a musical written in the 21st century, but about events which started in 1931, very firmly in the 20th century, and actually ran on, it turns in real time, for about 20 years if you study the wider historical story. So anyone listening will say, well, it's clearly based on a real story. What show are we talking about?
We're talking about the Scottsboro Boys, which is a late Kander and Ebb musical. Well, I use the word late advisedly because
well, that's correct for Mr. Ebb.
One of them is not around anymore. And so this is one of the shows that, like Curtains, has sort of, as it were, come to light since the death of Fred Ebb. And it's a really good show. And in fact, it's very rare for me to see a show that goes quickly into my sort of pantheon of shows that I really rather like and respect. Perhaps one of the reasons for that is that it does play to their strengths, and of course what they're most famous for is Cabaret and Chicago, those two. Both of those shows use the sort of framework of a cabaret or vaudeville venue, basically, within which they then tell a story, and this is no different in that respect. It's the story of a large group of young black men who in the South are arraigned on what I think we have to understand from the show at least is definitely considered to be a false accusation of rape.
Yes.
And whose many attempts to become free take years and years and years. And it's presented, so unlike Cabaret, which is presented as a 1930s Berlin cabaret with a lot of nods to Kurt Weill, and Chicago, which is presented as a sort of American vaudeville. This is presented as a minstrel show. A slightly less well-known form, certainly for modern audiences, because they just don't happen anymore, in which black performers or people in blackface perform popular sort of song of, you know, the sort of very early part of the 20th century, and there is an interlocutor who is a white person who essentially is the person who's the sort of narrator, bridge to the audience.
Showmaster.
The showmaster, the ringmaster, as it were, exactly. So all of which really puts them very much in their sort of comfort zone in terms of sort of how it works, and of course it does have the same effect. We're talking about a very serious case being presented with a lot of cheery numbers, which of course are very ironic when they come around, because the situation is that these people are in jail, and it turns out in some cases have no hope of not being in jail.
But I think we should talk...
They're on death row, actually, for quite a lot of it.
We should actually say, however, the numbers don't undercut the narrative. In a strange sense, the narrative undercuts the numbers.
Yes.
The strength of the story, the power of the story, the injustice being shown is so immense that even when you think you're being given there's a lot of parallels in some strange way with Oh What a Lovely War, which we've discussed previously here on Musical Talk, in the sense that some of the songs, and this is very much in the minstrel tradition, are lively and bouncy, exactly as you say.
Yep.
And sometimes you've seen something so horrendous on the stage before you, and then you're presented with this bouncy, happy number,
Yep.
and you grasp at it, because human beings have this thing where they don't always want to be, it's not always miserable. You know, if something jolly comes along, you pick at it, and then they pull the rug from under you again. There's a fantastic song which one of the poor chaps, one of the 9 Scottsboro boys, I think he's talking about his cousin, and the cousin is a tearaway from child. He's a black boy, yeah. And the song is very bright and bouncy, and it's done in sort of silhouette, and it's amusing. So the boy has a bit of a reign of terror. He lies about stealing money, and he does this and that and breaks things,
yeah.
but he lies about it. He never tells the truth. That's the point of the story.
Yeah.
And it's about a much wider issue about always telling the truth, even if you're not believed in the bigger story, the Scottsboro Boys' own story. And it's done almost as a comedy.
Yeah.
And his last sort of crime this boy does is tying a firework to a cat's tail, accidentally kills the cat.
Yes.
But it's done in a way that you think, oh, you know, you no way condone it because it's bad behaviour, but it's sort of beautifully done, fun. Yes, it's cartoonish, exactly. And then it completely undercuts you, because the next scene is when they lynch him, and the world turns on a sixpence around that, and suddenly you realise that you've been laughing at the first half of this song, and then it turns horrible. And then he has this very odd coda where the boy goes up to, I think it's called Billy, goes up to St. Peter at St. Peter's Gate on the entrance to heaven, and the boy is asked by St. Peter what he's done, and he turns good. He confesses his crimes, so you think he's going to get in, and he does. He gets into heaven, but he's only allowed in through the back door, the tradesman's entrance kind of thing, because he's black.
Because racial segregation happens in heaven too.
Absolutely. And so this song has almost 2 punches. It has the punch of the lynch, which is actually the strongest punch, and then it lets you know that the status quo is wherever it is.
Well, it's very bitter. I mean,
bitter, brilliant word.
Yeah. Yes, and there's a tremendous amount of sort of bitterness and unhappiness that sort of comes through the whole thing. It is a very harsh story, and the other thing actually that's quite a sort of notable parallel, I suppose, with previous Kander and Ebb is that they also have the song Nothing in this, which is yet another take, because Mr. Cellophane in Chicago is a take on Burt Williams'
Nobody
vaudeville act, which was called Nobody, and of course this one also is basically the same type of treatment.
We should just briefly explain Burt Williams to those people who haven't heard. We've mentioned him several times before, but he's the first bona fide black vaudeville comic actor who became a star in his own right. And he had this famous song, which is recordings of which still exist. You can hear them. Yeah. They're all over online, called Nobody. You know, and the conceit of the song is, you know, when I come home, who's there to greet me? Nobody. It's a song of loneliness.
It's a pathos song.
It is. Well, it's a comedy pathos song to a degree. I mean, you're not supposed to take him seriously.
I ain't never done nothing to nobody.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so, as you say, that song, which is a famous song in the history of American vaudeville and indeed in the black tradition, is being used and reused here we are as late as 2015.
Yeah, absolutely. It also has a little bit of in common with Parade, I think, which is also a sort of Southern Justice musical, as it were, and by Jason Robert Brown. But the scenario, although there isn't an accusation there too of an attempted sort of sexual assault, is a little bit different. Here I think we are more in the world of Chicago, with the Mary Sunshine character again sort of reappearing in the form this time of the girls who make the accusation, because of course that's done in drag. And there's basically a core cast of... I'm trying to think how
there are 9 Scottsboro boys.
That's right, yeah, okay. And the interlocutor, and a couple of other... And finally, a bookending character, female character, who turns out to be... Sorry to spoil the ending for everybody, but I don't think it will really spoil it for you. Rosa Parks, looking back at the case from the perspective of the 60s.
I want to talk about her character a bit later on. What about there's... Because there was also Mr. Bones and Mr. Tambo, as in tambourine.
Yeah, so there are sort of 9 principal actors, but also characters Mr. Bones, Mr. Tambo, who are the sort of lead players, if you like, outside of the interlocutor. And
they are part of the original minstrel show. They were, if you like, the comics who would come on.
Yes,
they were
sort of clown-like characters, basically, and dressed accordingly. and the rest is a young cast of young men, basically, who sort of sing and dance their socks off, basically. It's a really energetic show.
Well, I think more than that, they act their socks off too, to be honest.
Yes, exactly.
It's worth mentioning, because I did a fair bit of research once I'd seen the show, so striking and powerful was it, that of the original 9 Scottsboro boys, the oldest was 19,
Yes.
2 were 13.
Which is incredible, yeah.
Which is quite an age range, and not one of them was out of teenagehood.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story, and this accusation went on for such a long time. And in fact, the story as recorded in the programme is a good deal simplified in the musical, which is has also the tremendous advantage of being a no interval, a straight through type of thing.
I mean, it could be a 2-actor, because by which I mean, it lasts about 2 hours, so you could put an interval in, but it worked the better for being in a feature film model, shall we say?
That's right, exactly, yeah. And I suppose also it has that slight commonality with Assassins as well, actually, in the sense that there is a sort of strong sense of review to it, but for the very strong narrative. I mean, one thing that's sort of striking about the production style of this, and in a way shouldn't be, is that the casting, except for the interlocutor, who is played by a white actor, is colourblind casting in the sense that all of the main cast are black. And they will play all of the roles which might in another production of the same story, be played by white actors, because it's significant that the lawyer is white, that the judge is white, that the governor of Alabama is white, and so on.
Can I ask, you say colourblind? I think, but that is actually deliberate, isn't it? The 9 Scottsboro boys are black because they were black in the piece, and they need to be black to make this work. But it's made very plain that, I mean, the two, shall we say, the characters who remain in the minstrel tradition throughout, Mr. Bones and Mr. Tambo, which represents the musical instruments, by the way, they're supposed to play, I'm told. They sort of come on in what we would think of as sort of vaudeville clown costumes, trousers which don't fit, an outsized collar, sort of big plaid and checks on the clothing and things like that. Yeah. Not in blackface. We'll talk about blackface later. No one is in blackface until the very end.
Yes.
And that has a significance which is important. But they are playing these characters, and they are black because they're part of the minstrel troupe who are supposedly putting this forward and showing us it. But they play all the white characters, which is the complete reverse of the minstrel tradition as was handed down through most of the 20th century, and indeed the Victorian era, when in fact it was white actors dressed up as black men.
That's right, exactly.
And here we have black men pretending to be white men. Now, there's no white face makeup either.
No.
They are just... But so you've got the prejudiced judge, the prejudiced sheriff, and they're all played by these black men doing stereotyped, appalling characters.
It's a very interesting and brave sort of area to go, because it's sort of, there's a discomfort to being aware of some of the politics of, like, black actors playing white actors playing black actors sort of playing black characters in a certain kind of a way, which references a tradition which, a lot of people, well, pretty much everybody, I should think, now consider consigned to history. And it's very edgy, and it's not there to make the audience feel particularly comfortable. And I wonder if this is, why this hasn't been perhaps the most lauded thing. There are actually, whereas in things like Cabaret, there's a very obvious other, which is the Nazis. Basically, it's kind of easy to know which side you're supposed to be on. And while that's also the case in this, in as much as clearly we're on the side of the Scottsboro boys, the style in which it's done is just a little bit discomforting. It raises some of our sort of little hackles about what the discourse is on race, in it.
Well, this is the point. I mean, you could argue,
and it starts to make us examine our own, prejudices about sort of what about all the things we've just talked about.
Our unexamined prejudices for the most part. Exactly. Yes, things we've taken as read. I mean, there is an argument, and I don't subscribe to it, but there is an argument that 2 wrongs don't make a right in this case. That if it is wrong for white men to caricature black men, shall we say, which is the minstrel tradition as we understand it, then it is equally wrong for that to be reversed. And that might be an argument if it weren't for the fact it was being done for a point. And there is a point behind it, and that point is not that subtle.
But also,
it's very
of course, don't
obvious,
forget the authors are white. So I mean, that's also not to be
understated.
Yes, understated or forgotten. But so I mean, but basically, it sort of leads us to a conversation which is kind of difficult to sort of to think about. It oughtn't to, because I mean, in a sense, the casting is colourblind, and in fact, I was just.
But what do you mean by colourblind in this sense?
Well, I mean,
because I think everyone has been cast on a colour basis.
Well, this is exactly it. It's somewhere between, because actually, colourblind casting, of course, would mean that in theory any actor can play any race part, and gender, and indeed there are people who play characters who aren't of their own race or aren't of their own gender in this.
I saw a very excellent Adrian Lester, famous British black actor, playing Nicky, the young drug addict son in Noel Coward's The Vortex a few years ago, and he had a white mother, but nobody batted an eyelid. That was fine.
Yeah, it didn't really matter, and nor does it here really.
But I think it would. I think if you cast white actors, it wouldn't work.
Because the piece is making a specific point about that very thing, it sort of makes you more aware of it. I suppose that's really all we can say about that. It's a very interesting and as I say, slightly subversive thing to attempt, and to the extent that I think there has been controversy, and some people are saying, the particularly the blackface at the end, where you are asking black actors to get into blackface is with a white production or white writing team. There could be an argument that that's pretty dangerous ground to go onto, and I think however, bravely gone onto that ground.
Well, let's talk about that finale, because that finale is very striking as well. So once you've been through the show has two different finales, a finale proper and a coda. The coda is the Rosa Parks part, and we'll talk about that, but I want to talk about, if you like, the finale number. So all the way through, you've been seeing the characters of the 9 Scottsboro boys and the horror they've had to go through. And the story is coming to a kind of end. Not a happy ending. I think the best you can call it is neutral for a few of the characters.
Yes.
And that really is about the best score you can get out of it. But you've got to know these actors, and it's cleverly written in the sense that it's not simplistic, in the sense that of those 9 Scottsboro boys, they're not all nice people. There's one who's a coward and will sell out the others for his own skin, and that's shown several times.
Yeah.
So they're not. It's not simply they are all good and they've been falsely accused. They have all been falsely accused, but they are a full cross section of society in the sense that there's good and there's bad. Amongst them, or at least people who are harder to feel sympathy for in relation to their individual characters, I think might be a better way of putting it. And very strong characters and weaker characters, and older and wiser and less wise and younger, things like that. So they're not homogenous, and that's the important thing. They are not homogenous. They are 9 individual characters. Over the course of the show, you have got to know those 9 characters. You know who they are. They're brilliantly performed by our actors. They do a fantastic job, I must say. And then in the finale, they come out in true minstrel style. So they are actually wearing minstrel costumes. And so they're matching.
Undifferentiated.
And they've got black face. And the thing that immediately struck me was, I can't recognise who's who. No. So that was shown to me in the most stark way.
Well, basically, it says that they become de-individuated,
dehumanised.
Yes.
Absolutely, that was the point, and that's why I think it was such an important ending, and so right, whilst at the same time being very, very difficult, because it immediately showed you that what a mask blackface was.
Yeah.
And what a mask blackface still is when used, it dehumanises, and that is the point, isn't it? That the minstrel show is a white entertainment, not a black entertainment. It was for white punters for the most part, and quite often performed mostly by white performers wearing a black face. Yeah. So by framing the entire show through the minstrel tradition, shall we say, what you're actually saying is, let's look at the predicament of these 9 people, for the most part, through the eyes of white people, and not through the eyes of black people. Even though we're a sophisticated 21st century audience and we can see what's going on, and we are drawn to the characters of the 9 Scottsboro boys, and we can see what's happening to them, so we have that extra layer of sophistication and understanding on it. The prism, if you like, of how white culture wrongly perceived black culture and placed it into stereotypes is then played all the way through and underlined by the minstrelsy in relation to how they are when the first time they go to court. They, basically they are at the beck and call of their white defence lawyer who sleeps, played by one of the Mr. Bones or Mr. Tambo, the prosecution person who uses basically the most prejudiced arguments in favour of the 2 white girls from Alabama who claim to have been raped, things like that. So the whole thing is through the prism. And I think that's why that works. If it didn't have that point, it would be very difficult to watch indeed. And you were making that point. Yeah. I think from the first sentence, I mean, the audience we went with, i.e. the auditorium, was a standard West End audience for the most case. Yeah. Mostly middle class, you would have guessed, mostly white, not completely, but a liberal, mostly. Probably white middle class audience who knew what they were going to see, I think, for the most part. It's a show I don't think you'd stumble upon by accident. But I think it's the second line spoken in the entire piece, and it is by Julian Glover's white interlocutor character, the sole white character on stage, and still very, very clearly, even though he pretends to be friendly with his minstrels, when he needs to tell them to do something or demand something of them, he is very much a character who is essentially a plantation owner or a figure of authority.
Southern gentleman.
Yes, if you like. Gentleman is such an unusual word in that phrase, but... the very second line I think he uses, forgive me, once again, this is a word that we wouldn't use in any other context except in this discussion, he uses the word Sambo.
Yeah, he does.
Now, interestingly, you can feel the audience immediately go, oh! There was clenching, everyone was immediately put on their guard. Suddenly, this is not going to be an easy show. Not that anyone thought it was going to be, but it was that soon in, you saw that. It was also a clever writing choice, actually, because if they'd gone for the N-word, which I'm not going to say, it would have almost fallen into a stereotype of what it was trying to do itself. Yeah. It used a hugely, hugely racially offensive term, but not the one you would have expected and gets most comment on. It is, it's a very antiquated term and deeply offensive, but it's not the one that would have almost been... Do you understand what I'm saying? I think if it had been the N-word, we're hardwired into reacting because it has so much cultural resonance. This one has cultural resonance in exactly the same way. Bad cultural resonance, but a cultural resonance. Yes, but it's not overused.
There's a different tone, and it's not so sort of... it's more patronising.
Yes, that's exactly what it is, isn't it?
No, I think it's. I think it uses that. Very. We talked about the process of discomforting. Perhaps we should talk a little bit about the framework and actually how the show was structured together, because there were a lot of these little asides, and you talked about the one which is to make friends with the truth, for example. There's assorted other ones as well.
You're talking about the bouncier numbers in the score?
The bouncier numbers, like the one at the beginning, hey, 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 and everything, it was a huge, great big opening.
I think you'll find that was the arrival of the Fonz in the audience.
Stuff about Alabama Ladies, which was the two girls who make the accusation. And there's also a very, if you'll forgive this, an electrifying routine about the electric chair, which is a horror sequence. Basically, it's the nightmare of one of the young, particularly
the 13-year-old,
the youngest, Eugene, of the Scottsboro boys. Yeah, that portrays this terrifying sort of portrayal. Actually, nothing so much reminded me of like Dennis Potter almost, who of course does the same sort of thing in a way as Kander and Ebb do. To use that popular song in the nightmarish context. Yeah, there's several of those. And
can I ask, though, it was a nightmare, it was a horrible song, and yet it was done in a non-realistic way. It was a dream sequence, and therefore, in a sense, was there not also not comedy in it, but it was sort of it was
lurid
up.
And
choreographically, it was so over the top.
Yes, absolutely.
But actually, I think you had to take it as a piece of light entertainment in order to give you a
well, exactly. Except, of course, that he's singing about something that's been proposed to actually happen to him. You see, So yeah,
the electrocution to death of the 13-year-old. It sounds appalling, just said as a sentence, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So there are many such things, and in it, and I think they are used. They may be touch overused. I don't know, because in the latter stages of the show there is a slight sense of repetition, and again on another occasion we talked about Oh What a Lovely War, where there is perhaps not quite that sense, and because there's always some sort of new spin or a new perspective on the war being presented, and here. There is one struggle. The struggle is for all of them to leave jail, basically, and for justice to be done, and that's in essence what it is. They do sort of montage together about sort of six or seven appeals. Can't remember exactly how many. Yes, exactly. That are attempted over the years.
But isn't
by
that
Samuel
the point?
Leibowitz.
I mean. It seems to me that you say that there's repetition, but actually it is the most amazingly repetitious story in that sense.
Yes, that's right. It sort of grinds you down, just as it ground them down, really, in terms of plea bargaining and attempts to sort of resolve the matter, and
And the reason they fail, I mean, for the most part, very oddly, isn't it, is once again it's prejudice, but it's a different kind of prejudice, for North-South prejudice in this case. Yeah. Because what actually happens is, and this is very... this is a cut-down version of what happens, but the North...
As presented in the musical,
as presented, the North sees a miscarriage of justice going on in Alabama, and steps in and keeps finding... Basically, the Supreme Court keeps finding flaws in the judicial process.
That's right.
In these trials, and so they have to keep having retrials. And indeed, they get a famous New York lawyer.
Well, when you say they, actually, in the real world, that was done by
the Communist Party.
The Communist Party, International Labour Defence.
Which gives it an extra layer of difficulty in America in the 1930s,
exactly,
of course, yes.
Yeah.
And indeed anywhere in the West. But yes.
They became, to a certain extent, a sort of political football, didn't they, really?
Very much so. But I quite liked, I really liked the American lawyer, the New York American lawyer, who's Jewish. And he comes down, and first of all, the performance is fantastic because the character of the actor portraying him, he's clearly doing George M. Cohan, who is, if you almost like the epitome of the Yankee.
Yeah.
He's and he even speaks like that, that kind of New York.
Yeah.
And he was. I turned to you in the audience, and you'd spotted it anyway. But
yes.
he was essentially, give my regards to Broadway. If he'd stepped into that number, it wouldn't have felt that much out of place.
No, that's right.
In terms of who that character was, and he's wearing this plaid. Almost if you were going to draw a stereotype of a New York solicitor, you probably concoct it from various Broadway and American shows, and that's what you'd come up with. Yep. But then, and I thought this was very clever because we're in the heart of Alabama, whose track record on race is not strong, certainly in this period. I think it's polite. And he's Jewish, this lawyer, and the prosecuting counsel, who's a local boy, presumably, an Alabama man, basically says, and I believe these words were actually used in the trial, that basically he accuses the Scottsboro boys of using, and you'll forgive me for saying so, but it's a quotation, Jew money.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that was equally shocking, and it just reminded you that actually the prejudice wasn't purely against the Scottsboro boys and the black residents. It was everybody, that pretty much anyone who wasn't from Alabama stock. And they made, the two women were going to be arrested in the very first scene on the train for being prostitutes. And it's only because they claimed that they'd been raped that they suddenly turned into these virtuous Alabama women. But it was very much our girls versus all these out-of-staters. And the Scottsboro boys aren't local, are they? They're coming into Alabama on a train to look for work. So it's very much, it's dislike of the unlike, isn't it? Which, if you don't mind me saying, is very much a simplistic definition of Nazism.
Well, yes. I mean, they do. All of that is portrayed. Now, actually, in a sense, it does seem to be a fairly honest sort of interpretation of what sort of really happened, in as much as, although it was a protracted and handled in a much more sort of protracted fashion than is shown in the musical, that this really was what it boiled down to. It was a struggle between people who didn't conventionally have a voice, and but who in the North people believed should have, and an extremely powerful establishment in the South that had a vested interest in trying to make sure that if an injustice were going to be perpetrated, that it was not discovered and overturned.
But we have this very odd sense of attrition going on, don't we, as well, because there's retrial after retrial after retrial, and because it is portrayed by the prosecution witness in the Alabama court as they are coming, whoever they are, but they are coming in to overturn our justice. The jury always returned a guilty verdict, even when people, one of the prostitutes had retracted her evidence and said it was all a lie.
Yes.
In another very upbeat, rather splendid number.
Yes.
Possibly one of the very few genuinely lively songs that doesn't have anything cut away from it until you realise they're still found guilty.
Yes.
But that's a narrative decision, not a song decision, if that makes sense. Or it follows on immediately from the song, but it isn't in the song. So you can enjoy that song briefly for 3 lovely minutes. But even when the evidence has been retracted by one of them, at least one of the prostitutes, it's still very much everyone's trying to fiddle with our processes. We're not going to do it. So we were talking about the war of attrition. The attrition comes with all these trials and retrials and retrials and retrials.
Yes, and Supreme Court decisions as well.
And it becomes apparent that Alabama, as a state, wants out of this as well, because they're just getting bad press. And it's also, there's a throwaway line to the point that actually it was costing Alabama so much to keep having these retrials, it couldn't afford it anymore. They try to find some kind of bizarre compromise, don't they?
Yes.
But it dawns on the Scottsboro boys that whilst they are a cause célèbre across the country, they're probably going to be at least safe from execution because there'll be trials and retrials.
That's right.
But the story will get old. And over the course of the 30s, that's exactly what happens. People become less and less interested as the world moves on, and indeed
pardons are rejected,
and we move towards war nationally, internationally. Exactly. What seems to happen is a plea bargain takes place, releasing 4 of the youngest, but leaving 5 to fester, shall we say.
Yes.
And then we get this other thing, whereby if the 5 remaining ones plead guilty, they will be immediately pardoned and asked to leave, told to leave Alabama, i.e. exiled, as a way of dealing with it. But the issue we have here, and this all comes down to not telling the truth, if you aren't guilty, why would you say that you are? And this becomes the quandary towards the second half, or one of the many quandaries in the second half. So it is, in fact, actually, it doesn't matter if you've got justice on your side. There's attrition plays up. That, in a way, that was also almost as, not quite, but in parallel, as gut-wrenching.
Yeah.
That the justice has nothing to do with it. It's all about outside factors about which you can have no
That's
control.
right, yeah.
And that includes public interest. So even the people who are on your side will let things slip. You know, in someone's head, someone will have said, well, releasing 4 because they're young and leaving 5 is a solution. That's an answer. It's more than we would have got. Let's leave it there. Leaving 5 in the lurch.
Yeah, it's a very ugly, and
ugly's the word. Yes.
Yeah, it's a scenario, and but it's a great. If you don't mind me putting it this way, it's an amazing story, and
it is,
and well worth sort of recording in this format. I don't know how well it will persist. I mean, this is a kind of an interesting question. It seems to me that something that could well become a piece on the circuit that quite a lot of groups might do, because that's kind of how a lot of these things get their future, isn't it? You know, as well, after their initial productions. It has it run on Broadway? Yes, it has.
Yes, it ran on Broadway for, I believe, only 3 months.
Right, okay.
Whereas it's actually done better in Britain. So it came to the Young Vic here in Britain and was massively successful, and then has transferred to the Garrick, where we caught it. It's now closed in London, but it did 6 months at the Garrick, so that on top of whatever it did at the Vic is actually a much bigger run. The question you raise is a good one.
Yeah.
Why is it more popular in Britain than in America? Is it too raw even now? I mean, do you know when the Scottsboro boys were finally pardoned or exonerated?
I don't know offhand, but I can look it up in the...
I know the answer. I can tell you.
That was? Oh, yes, in 2013.
2013.
Which was, in fact, after this show had begun to run in... it was actually... on November 21st, which was actually a month after the London premiere of the Scottsboro Boys, and in fact it was in 2010 in the Vineyard Theatre in New York. So
the story hadn't quite finished even when it was being written and first performed.
No, that's right.
Isn't that an indictment?
Yeah, it is. I think it probably will get done, and I think it will get done in America, and I think it probably will get done in the southern states as well, actually, because eventually. I think that will be of interest as a sort of as a matter of history. I hope it gets done more, and I kind of think it could work on film, but I think it would be quite a daring thing to do. And of course, Chicago gets significant, and both Chicago and Cabaret had to be significantly reframed in order to work on film, and I think the same would be true for this story too, because you don't quite have the sort of theatrical device, that you can use so easily. But I hope it's not the last we hear of it in London, and I hope it does come round again. I'm certainly going to be availing myself of the album.
Well, here's what I want to ask you about the score, because the score is very strong. It is in a particular tradition, but as we've said, it's rather like Oh What a Lovely War. Some of the songs are very heavy, some of the songs are lighter, although they have that rug-pulling ability underneath. But it paces you, it gives you moments to grasp and to draw your breath a little bit. But the songs are so seamlessly included in the narrative, which, as we all know, is what a good musical does. Do we think that any of those songs will ever escape the score?
That's an interesting question. I think they belong very much in the sort of traditions that they're written in. So, I mean, they're not sort of... I suppose there could be a couple. I mean, the Make Friends with the Truth number is basically is fundamentally a solo for Hayward. We've got things like I was looking for the solos actually, because those are the ones that tend to sort of
become audition pieces.
Yes,
and become popular?
Fundamentally, yeah. So the Nothing song, which is the one that we said was based on Burt Williams, might do. Some of the company numbers probably are harder to bring out, and then there's That's Not the Way We Do Things, which is the Samuel Leibowitz song as well. It seems to me some could well. For me, there wasn't a standout song in the score, other than sort of in terms of concept rather than musicality. So there aren't quite the torch songs of Cabaret, for example, that sort of leapt out as ones on my side. But then if you look at the versions of Cabaret, the many versions of Cabaret, the film and the stage and so on, maybe this will get rejigged again. I don't know.
I must say that...
But then Assassins never had a breakout song either, even
no.
Unworthy of Your Love, which was written as a sort of soft pop song,
although I think it's one of the weakest scores, part of that score, if I may say.
Yeah, well, quite. Yeah.
I would say that the score is very strong, but it's very strong within the context of what it's doing. So I enjoyed. When I say enjoyed, I think I have to clarify that. We were both moved and impressed by the whole show as a piece of theatre and a piece of musical theatre. I think the score does precisely what it needs to do. It's a very good example of what it needs to do. So they could have done it really badly, but they didn't. They did it really well.
Yeah.
But is it a score that I will remember? No, it's a score I will remember as part of a show. I think I would find it very difficult to detach it.
Yes, and probably we'll listen to it on that basis.
We haven't spoken about the coda. Now, I think you and I differ on this because as we went home after this, we discussed it in some detail. You were a little less impressed. Let's talk. There's this woman.
The suggestion is that the woman we see throughout the show,
who says not a word until the very end.
Indeed, yeah. Who sort of seems to consider, if you like, the case, or be sort of paying attention to the case of the Scottsboro boys. Finally, as you say, speaks at the end, at which point we realise that she's on a bus and that she's got a seat that she's being asked to give up, and that she refuses to do so. In other words, that she is Rosa Parks. I suppose that what it attempts to do is to make a clear link between this case and the civil rights movement, that was a sort of significant moment along with the sort of Birmingham College admissions and all of those sorts of things.
This is a feeder story for that.
Yes, exactly. And so I kind of think that sort of makes sense. I mean, I found it a little bit unnecessary, to be honest, because I think as a story in and of itself it works, and I didn't need sort of that pointing out to me in quite such explicit terms. But I mean, yeah, that's how I felt. What
I found interesting was, afterwards, once I'd finished researching it, that I hadn't realised, and I don't think they should have made anything of this, because if they had, they would have completely misfocused the story or given us a false step. But it turns out that Rosa Parks was in one of the demonstrations on behalf of the Scottsboro boys in the 30s, where she met her husband.
That's true, yes. So there is that person.
Who was a much more political activist person than she was, and from whom she developed her own activism, which ultimately bore fruit.
That's right.
So there is a connection, a proper connection. Yeah. However, I only discovered that by reading various bits of research afterwards, rather than by knowing it. I don't know if it is known. Certainly the Scottsboro Boys story itself is not widely known in Britain, is it? Did that in any way strengthen or hinder the story for you? Because we were coming on it fresh, I think.
Yes, I think that's true, and I suppose in a sense, yes, it did really. I mean, in the same way that the
yes, it did. What, hinder or strengthen?
It strengthened. Yeah. I mean, in the same sense that Parade, for example, I hadn't been aware of that particular case before sort of seeing the musical of it. So I think it enabled it to be presented in a particular way, and yes, I didn't come with any notions already about what it was, so I suppose it's sort of.
And also, we are British and therefore not in the American tradition, and therefore we also don't come to it with any intentional or unintentional cultural baggage in relation to the American experience.
No, I mean, I think you can't avoid bringing some cultural baggage to this, because
no, of course,
just because of the sort of. I mean, we've talked about it at great length, but obviously the staging conventions and the casting conventions are things that pretty much everybody alive at this time, is going to have some sort of.
I didn't mean that so much, though. I actually meant that the situation in America itself throughout the 20th century. Yeah. Britain had a view on that. The view in Britain on the whole was we were much more keen on the North's attitude than the South's attitude, certainly, for the most part.
That's right.
So that didn't need to be done. But we're looking at it from the point of view of someone watching, rather than being involved.
Yes, I mean, I think the.
So we could be more neutral, I suppose, is what we're saying.
I don't know. I think that there's racial politics here just as much as anywhere else, and.
I'm not for one second suggesting we live on paradise in Earth.
No.
And of course, we have the Empire as our own luggage. Yeah. But it's a different tradition of prejudice.
Yes. I don't know. I think the problem is you don't really know what your baggage is that you're bringing to something, and
someone pokes it.
I think we've sort of skirted around that a little bit, haven't we? Just talking about this and just been a little bit aware that we all have a view. But so I didn't feel like I was watching it in an objective sense. It was it was a specific portrayal of that specific trial, and it was very interesting as a piece of social history and also as a piece of human drama. And to be honest, it's rare enough to find something that does both of those things successfully in one package, and for that I'm grateful.
Yes, a very great show. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim.
Good to speak to you as ever.
musical talk. Well, there we have it. That was Tim Saywood and I in conversation about the Scottsboro Boys. One of the best shows I've seen for a very long time. Certainly one of the most powerful shows. And when somebody comes up to you and says, oh, musicals are just light and frothy and have no genuine worth, they have no real drama, then I think that this should be one of your first arguments against that. As a white 21st century middle-class, middle-aged theatre-goer, I was made uncomfortable by the show, which is what the show was there to do for my demographic. But that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy the show, quite the reverse. I was made uncomfortable, but I was struck by the show, I was engaged by the show, and ultimately I give it the accolade of being one of the best musical shows I have seen for a very long time. If you get the chance to see the Scottsboro Boys in any form, in any place, in any way, make a point of trying to do so. It doesn't matter if you don't know the story in advance, the narrative really explains as you go along. Although I must say that on the very night I came back from seeing it in the theatre, I spent a good hour online researching the real historical facts, and depressing they are. But what an exhilarating night in the theatre I had. That's the Scottsboro Boys. A great show. And that was an episode of Musical Talk. It's not for me to describe it as great, grating perhaps, but then again, in the case of a podcast, beauty is in the ear of the beholder. And incidentally, here's a big hello to one of those ear-owning beholders. That's Tommy Colmer. Hello Tommy, I think you're a regular listener, who I know listens to this show in the early hours of the morning. Go to bed, Tommy. Well, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's made you think. I hope it's opened your eyes and opened your mind to what a good show can be, and how content doesn't always directly dictate form in the way that you might have thought. Well, that's all the thoughts I can actually spare you for the time being. I shall now have a shortage for the rest of the week, so I'm going to sign off. Which means it's time for me to say goodbye. Here's me doing so. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2015. And don't forget to go along to Facebook and Twitter to look at our social network outpourings. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at Musical Talk Thos. Is your toe clicking? Is that what that is?
Yeah, it's a habit.
Yeah, I used to have that. It'll give you arthritis.
Everyone says that, but it hasn't yet.
No.
Of course, that's...
Well, I'll come back to you in 30 years. Let's see how you are.
I suppose. Oh, it's not 30 years anymore, it's 20 years now.
When do you think it'll start for you? 60?
Well, yeah, I mean...
Oh, sorry, 59?
Exactly.